All right, everybody, welcome back. It's the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and today we were talking about the comic classic from 1986, 1987. That's right, it's Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen. But before we get into all that, we have an update about bird flu / regular flu, and we have a witness on the ground in California.
Yeah, I'm reporting direct from the West Coast. I have the flu. I can report that the flu is here in California. Although it's weird, right? Like trying to figure out what you have now. I feel.
Yeah, is this just another COVID? Is this
I have COVID. It's not noro because I think that's puking.
Yeah, that's a vomitous
So it feels like
illness.
flu or something COVID, but I'm like really floored in a way that I wasn't when I had COVID the first couple times.
Yeah.
Like worse for sure. And I think I caught it I think in an act of like
Heroism? You were
like
saving an
sabotage.
old lady?
I was watching the Canada-United States
Oh, yeah.
big hockey game at
Which
a
Canada
bar.
triumphed. We talked about this last week.
Yeah, and I flipped. All of a sudden,
It was a great game.
and I just went all in. And I got this sore throat and was like the next day I was like, oh, it's probably because I was yelling like an idiot, like when McDavid scored.
Did you go to a bar to watch the game?
Yeah. And then just from then, it's just been like sort of off a cliff. And
This is why my strategy of never socializing when you're out of town is
it does work. But yeah, it's definitely one of those. It's like a thing about when you're a hypochondriac and you actually get sick is then the next thing is determining how serious you're supposed to be taken. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, it's a boy who cried wolf scenario that we've discussed before, right?
Do I go in? When do you go in with the flu? Is it a certain temperature?
I don't know. I haven't,
Certain amount of time? Is 3 days normal or low?
I think that's pretty normal.
Well, I tried to get some and I did come across.
Now we're legislating your hypochondria.
I can sort of see maybe that why I was blindsided by this year's flu.
Oh yeah, go on, tell us.
So first, this is not a joke. There's been 700 deaths already from the flu.
Is that unusually high or?
I don't. It just says that's the amount. Oh no! Wait. See, sorry, I'm exhausted, but it says that this flu season has claimed more lives than in the last 6 years.
Okay.
I think also slightly anomalous. A quarter of the deaths, people under age 65. So I'm in there with, that's bad. And then it turns out, it says why you should care. This is on like a local California news site. Why you should care. I mean, it's self-evident, but it says usually flu season starts to slow down by February. Did you know that?
No, I did not.
This year, the numbers are still rising.
Oh, good.
And then I said, well, how? What could? And then the next sentence is, the CDC has scrapped a campaign promoting seasonal flu shots.
Oh, yeah.
Just days after outspoken vaccine skeptic Robert Kennedy Jr. became the nation's top health official. Decision to halt the ads comes amid one of the worst flu seasons in decades. The agency also canceled a conference with virus experts. Yeah. Why are we conferencing with virus experts when there's a new fucking virus every 35 seconds in this country?
It's
committee
unclear.
usually 3 times a year, but it looks like it's on the Doge chopping block.
Oh,
so,
good.
So I don't know. I'll keep listeners, hopefully listeners this week informed. I do hope there aren't too many viewers because I look like absolute garbage.
This is the week our Instagram reel goes mega viral. Guaranteed.
I'm not going to say whether to get a flu shot or not because I don't need to be like on top of my.
I think it's too late. I think you're supposed to get them.
No, for me, I know. if we give a PSA and we just start getting dragged by the worst corners of the internet, you know, and
Well, that would involve them having to be aware of us, which
I think they like have software that hits every podcast to see if the words like vaccine or whatever are
that
in there.
reads our transcripts on iTunes or
Yeah,
whatever.
on Grok. Is that what it's called? Grok or Grok?
I think it's Grok. I think it's a Hitchhiker's Guide reference, of course, because we're.
Did you see he just left his kid on the stairs? Did you see this clip?
I did not know.
It was pretty great. He's just walking after like a speaking engagement. The kid's with him because he has this one kid that he.
Yeah, X 2500 T1000 or whatever.
Yeah. And he just walks so fast and far ahead, completely forgetting that his tiny child is trying to walk down the stairs.
Yeah. Well, I hope Techno Mechanic is safe. That's one of the other kids.
Yeah.
Definitely a cool person. Hitchhiker's Guide, naming your kids weird things. This is like classic cool guy stuff, right?
Yeah. It's like classic villain behavior.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, that's been the vibe for a little while. God bless, you know?
Yeah.
So that's not good. But on the plus side, at least we don't have to deal with imminent threat of nuclear war and or annihilation.
Sure.
Which is the backdrop for our main topic this week, the end of Cold War classic comic book, Watchmen. Now, you'd never read this before, Michael, right?
No, like I said, I'd watched.
You watched the HBO show, which is kind of a mixed bag. What's that?
Surprised that it's taken this long to do this because you like love this thing, right?
Yeah,
this is one of your favorite comics, fair?
I would say. And I also just read comics obsessively for the last 7 years. It's the kind of funny thing where I, as a kid, read comics obsessively up until about the time I got into high school, when I just got more into playing sports and like being in a band and stuff like that. And also I went away to boarding school, so I couldn't really get them. It wasn't like I could go to the shop each week or whatever. So I gradually kind of fell off the
fix, huh?
Yeah, I couldn't. I mean, it is really an addiction, a fairly benign addiction, I would say. But so for 20 years, basically from 98 until 2018, I did not read comics at all. And then one day I used to work at John Jay College on the Lincoln Center area. One day after work, I was walking down and I said, "Oh, there's a comic shop." And I went in. And I kid you not, since that incident, I've gone every single week, aside from during COVID, a few other. But they just got the hooks right back into me.
Sure.
And, comics has changed a lot in the time, in the 20 years.
I do want to jump in and ask.
Sure.
Did you read The Watchmen as a kid in that first phase?
I didn't read it when I was 6 years old. No, but yes.
But
yes,
you didn't come across it.
Oh, you mean when I was? Yeah, of course I did. No, I read it when I was a teenager.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like,
I didn't read it when it was like coming out in single issues, like in the 80s. I probably read this. I actually know exactly when I read this. I read this one summer, I think after 7th or 8th grade. I was at basketball camp at Fairfield University, a proud Jesuit institution in Fairfield, Connecticut. And I went there many summers for sometimes multiple sessions. It was always fun. We got to meet the players. One of my counselors was the late former director of Canada basketball, Greg Francis. May he rest in peace. Yeah, he's a lovely guy. He was one of the coaches at the camp. He had a famous game where he scored like 28 points against UNC in the NCAA tournament and almost upset them. Yeah, in the first round. That was 1-16. I think it was like the Rasheed Wallace era.
Oh, wow. Pretty recent.
Well, the 90s,
Yeah, I mean, pretty recent compared to I thought you were talking about
I mean, I'm not that old, Michael. I went to basketball camp in the 90s.
Yeah, I guess I meant more like was he running the camp and was he like the old head at Fairfield? That's what I had.
He was a senior. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In any case, I was at the camp, and it was like not an overnight camp. It was a day camp, and I had just got the Watchmen graphic novel, and I remember reading it in the car ride home because I lived maybe 35-minute ride from the camp. So on the way home, I'd be like in the car trying to like tear through this book. And it was one of those reading experiences where I like could not, when I had a free moment, I had to be reading it. And I could not put it down. And I felt like almost like my mind was burning because it was so exciting. This is around the same time I read Catcher in the Rye for the first time.
I was gonna say, so it's sort of my Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I guess.
The book.
Yeah, which I guess explains our like.
Well, you were probably a little bit younger when you read that, right?
Yeah, I was a little younger, but that is the one that I like couldn't put down when I first picked.
Oh, I had a bunch of. I read a lot of those doll books when I was, second
Is he
grade.
canceled now? He's canceled, right?
Oh, he's kind of a monstrous guy, but
I love that. It's like, is he canceled? Like, no, he's just a monster.
Yeah, he said a lot of unfortunate things about Jewish people and.
But
Black
if you were to
people.
compare the two experiences, I guess 3 now probably. I assume you've read it again as an adult and then again for this.
Oh,
right?
I've probably read it 10 times.
Oh, really? Okay.
So like, yeah.
So I want to ask you a couple questions about it.
Sure.
Because I am interested in Moore's sort of the process of making the novel, and maybe you know something about it. But when you say it's like a Cold War era piece, right?
Yeah.
It's 86, 87, right?
Is when it's published, yes.
It's
set
published.
in 85.
Right. So it's definitely still going on, right?
Oh yeah.
He's not looking back with any retrospective, really. I mean, I think there's
he doesn't know the Cold War is about to end. No.
Right. And so like how do you think that he thought that it was on the horizon, or do you get the impression that he was like as stunned as anybody else when things started falling apart?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think Afghanistan comes up a bunch. He was very aware of the sort of Russian debacle in Afghanistan in the 80s. Mm-hmm. Certainly very aware of the rise of Gorbachev, right? And that like kind of new era. And that, I mean, the comic ends, spoiler alert, with détente, right? I mean, not even détente, like the USSR and USA are allies suddenly against the newfound.
I mean, it's a great ending. We'll go through the
we'll talk more about it in a minute. But do I think he thought the Cold War was on the verge of ending? I think a lot of people had some inkling. I mean, Berlin Wall falls in 89, just a couple years after this. I think there were cracks in the facade. Now, Moore is a leftist. He's not a right-wing guy at all. He despised Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and you kind of... and that's why, throughout the comic, Richard Nixon is actually still the president. Because
one of my favorite parts.
Well, one of the things we learn in sort of, that's what I love. Part of the reason I love this book so much is there's such a rich world, right? There are so many small details that you might not, at the first time I read it, I guarantee you I did not pick up on half of this stuff, and then when I went back through and thought about it again and reread it, you pick up on so much more. So much.
No, I know. There's so many little moments that have me like cackling. Like I actually screenshotted this one where like he's guy's there with like a chopper and an American flag, and Dick Nixon's like signs like "Hi Dick." And then it's like, there he is, first press helicopter into Saigon since the ceasefire. He's got the election in the bag for sure. It's like it's so funny.
Yeah, it's a very funny comic. I think Moore is underrated as a comedic writer.
Yeah.
Another thing is the reason Nixon's still in power, as we learn at a banquet sort of later on in the book, is that the comedian, the sort of super patriotic, ultra violent hitman kind of character, has murdered Woodward and Bernstein. Yeah. they've been discovered in a garbage dump somewhere, and it's like, it's also strongly implied that he is also the man who killed Kennedy, right? That he was like with Nixon in Dallas in '63, right? So there's lots of little subtle things like that. Another, I guess just to give a broader intro to people who are totally unfamiliar with the comic, like the basic premise is this is a world in which vigilantes are real, right? That costume vigilantes that appeared in American magazines and newspapers starting in the late 30s, people like Superman, Batman, but more for the most part, more like Batman than Superman. These are just like guys in suits who like beat up street thugs and like
Yeah.
bust criminal gangs. And they're kind of street level heroes. They don't have any special powers for the most part. They're just they have some of them have gadgets and technology. They're all very fit and they're all good at fighting. They have these kind of bulletproof costumes in many cases. But this all changes when the one actually superpowered individual emerges into the public eye in 1960, and that is Dr. Manhattan, who is kind of the central character that the whole universe circulates around. He is, I mean, the whole premise of Dr. Manhattan is great. He is John Osterman. He was a physicist. His dad was a watchmaker. And on learning of the Hiroshima bombing, the dad's like throws the watch that he's working on out the window and is like, watchmaking is over. You're going into physics, kid. So he goes to Princeton. He's a great character because he's the most powerful man in the world, but he's incredibly passive. Like nothing he has done in his whole life has really been his choice. He just his dad pushed him into this. He gets trapped in this intrinsic field removal device and is vaporized, basically. And everyone's like, oh my God, there was a safety lock. They couldn't open it because they wanted to prevent people from... safety lock backfired. He's disintegrated. And he's trying to get this watch he's fixing for his girlfriend. Like, it's just like this sequence of coincidences. He goes through this during one of his chapters where if this guy at a boardwalk hadn't knocked this watch out of her hand, it wouldn't have broken. He wouldn't have had to fix it. He wouldn't have forgotten it in his pocket. He wouldn't have gone back into the thing. Right? It's just like he's become this essentially omnipotent character who also experiences all of time simultaneously. Right? He exists outside of time, but he's kind of helpless to do anything. Like, he knows what he's going to do in the future at every moment, but he can't change it, right? Like,
Right.
And the way that...
there's like a flattening of existence sort of in that way, right?
Absolutely. And he's a little bit like Billy Pilgrim from Slaughterhouse-Five, that Vonnegut unstuck in time kind of characterization, which I think is probably something Moore had in the back of his mind. And, you know, the whole plot revolves around the evil mastermind character kind of taking him off the board for a little while so he can enact his devious plan to bring about world peace, right? like the center of this story is an incredibly evil plan that will kill millions, but the result of that plan will be world peace.
That's right.
Which is a wonderful conceit, right?
It's a fascinating one, at the least. We'll talk about it more towards the end when we get through some of this.
Yes.
Why don't you go through just sort of? I'd like to hear a bit about the characters and just how we come into the world, because it's interesting, right? It's a murder case.
It's a murder mystery. Yeah.
You start to expand out into this universe. It's quite wonderful.
So the story opens with this character I mentioned already, the comedian Eddie Blake, who's one of the original 40s era costume heroes who's still working 45 years later. He started out when he's 16. I think he's in his early 60s, still fit. He's got these patriotic like arm pads. He's based on the character of Peacemaker from the Charlton line. So one of the things that's behind all this is in the 80s, DC bought the rights to this old superhero universe that had ceased publication called Charlton Comics. And initially, Moore was just going to use those characters for Watchmen. And DC was like, well, we just spent a lot of money on these guys. Why don't we save them for later? And you can just make analogs. So he made sort of stand-ins for those characters. And the comedian is the stand-in for Peacemaker, who's John Cena was in a show on Max about the Peacemaker that was pretty popular. So he's around. He's still... Eddie Blake is murdered. We see him get thrown out of his window. He looks horrified, and even though he's super fit, he's unable to resist whoever it is that's beating him up, and he's dead. No one knows who he is, though. He still has a secret identity. He's just has a cover as like a diplomat. And the cops who are going through are like, oh, here's a president of him with a picture of him with Vice President Ford.
I know, I love that part too. Hang on here. Vice President Ford.
And Rorschach is the first character who kind of is our detective, right? Rorschach, along with Dr. Manhattan, is probably the most famous character to come out of this story for a lot of the wrong reasons. He's
sort of the guide through the story in some ways, right?
Yeah. He's the first narrator. He's a super hard-boiled, brutal vigilante who has a black and white moral code symbolized by the black and white mask that he wears that sort of changes face in the manner of a Rorschach blot test, right? And he's a parody of The Question and Mr. A, these characters created by Steve Ditko in the later 60s, who was the creator of Spider-Man, right? And Doctor Strange. He's a super influential early Marvel creator, but he had philosophical differences with Marvel because he was a hardcore objectivist who like loved Ayn Rand and hung out with Ayn Rand and like 100% believed in all of her philosophies to the end of his life. He died, I don't know, the last 10 years or so. Yeah. And he was always, if you wrote to him about objectivism, he'd write back to you.
Still.
But if you wrote to him about Spider-Man, he would not. So Rorschach is Moore's attempt at parodying this kind of black and white, absolute morality, there is no compromise. Unfortunately, a lot of people who read Watchmen don't get that and are just like, Rorschach is awesome. But throughout the story, we see that he's like lives in a disgusting hovel. His day job is carrying the end is nigh sigh outside Madison Square Garden. Like he eats nothing but sugar cubes and uncooked beans from a can. Yeah. He's meant to be.
Is this bean juice?
Yeah. Yes, human bean juice.
Human bean juice.
But he's the one who's investigating this murder. He thinks there's someone going around killing superheroes. That's the philosophy that he develops, or the theory that he develops. He used to be partners with Night Owl, who is one of the other main characters. Daniel Dreiberg. He's kind of over the hill, middle-aged guy, a little bit paunchy. He's retired. Vigilante. Being a costume vigilante was made illegal in the late 70s after a police strike. the police were like, enough of this shit. We want to be the only, so there was a bunch of riots. They were made illegal. And when this happened, Night Owl, Dan Dreiberg, retired, and he's independently wealthy. He just writes articles for like ornithological journals because he's obsessed with birds. Like, and he has this like bat cave like thing under his house where he has his owl ship and all this stuff. But he's just like an average Joe for the most part. And he's also impotent, right? One of the big themes of his character is impotence. Without his costume, he can't perform, shall we say. Right. That we talked about Dr. Manhattan a little bit already. He is still allowed to be a hero because he works for the government. Same with the comedian. And then his girlfriend is the Silk Spectre, the second Silk Spectre, Laurie Gispezzi, who's based kind of on a DC character, Black Canary, and a couple others. She's forced into being a superhero by her mom, right? She doesn't actually want to do it, but she has a super controlling mom who was the first Silk Spectre. And we see a few flashbacks of her as a teen, like training, and her mom's like, "You got to get."
Is it a hereditary thing across the board? Is it like an inherited thing?
No. Like Dan Dreiberg is the second Night Owl, but he's not the son of the first Night Owl. Okay, he just did it as a tribute to him. No. And then the last main character that we haven't talked about is, of course, Laurie's cool because she's married to Dr. Manhattan, or at least lives with him, and is having trouble relating to this like guy who can split himself in two while they're having sex.
He's so detached.
There's like a third hand comes in at some point. And she's like, "What?"
It definitely gives meaning to like, I know you're here, but it doesn't really feel like you're here.
Well, and then she goes to the other room, and there's another one of him like working on an experiment. Yeah. It's really great. She through the course of the series, she learns that she doesn't want to be with him anymore, so she starts dating Dan, the Night Owl guy, because he's a normal person. And she also learns this sort of mysterious history of her mother. For a long time, she knew that Eddie Blake, the comedian, tried to rape her mom at some point in the early 40s. And she hated him, and eventually she learns that after that incident happened, they later got together consensually, and that in fact Eddie Blake is her dad, right? Like she never knew who her real father is, but during her visit with Dr. Manhattan on Mars, she figures out that actually that he's my dad. Which is very traumatic. This guy you've always hated, thought was a monster. Oh no, actually that's your dad. Like, but it's good because everything in this ties together so nicely. Like all the main characters.
No, it's remarkable.
And then all the background characters too. Like by the end of the story, you see the cops from the investigation. You see the newsstand guy and the little kid who hangs out with him. You see the lesbian cab driver and her girlfriend. You see the guy who runs the taxi stand, and then his brother is the locksmith who's been right. It's like all these things tie together. Like it's absolutely architecturally brilliant comic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The last character to talk about is, of course, Adrian Veidt.
We must talk about Adrian Veidt.
Who's based on Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, another one of these Charlton characters. He's a gymnast and a genius, obsessed with, at first, Alexander the Great, but later realizes Ramses II is even greater than Alexander. He has a hash experience in Egypt that like makes him realize that's his true.
Sends him Ramses' way.
Yeah, exactly. He's the villain, right? It's not obvious at first, but you can kind of figure it out.
They do a good job of. It's not like all about the suspense of what happened to the comedian, but it's not revealed too quickly. The balance of the story is excellent.
Yeah, it's a remarkable piece of work. He murders the comedian. He's the one who's been manipulating Rorschach on this pointless quest. He is the one who's causes.
And he eventually comes clean.
Well, after he's done it, yeah.
Yeah, but like
he's not a Republic serial
lays
villain,
it out.
right?
He lays it out for everybody. What?
And like you can't do anything because if you
That's
do, you'll ruin my world peace. It's a real catch-22 situation. Basically. He's realized he's also he's like a stock genius. He watches like 30 TVs at once and is like, oh, more bodybuilding ads, invest in fertility drugs or he's like, he claims he's using the Burroughs cut up technique to like analyze information by having this massive flow all at once.
Right.
Not sure that actually works, but it's a fun conceit. Imagine how much he would love being on Twitter, right? He could have Twitter, have a YouTube thing open, have a Twitch stream over there, just be like, he has like weaponized ADHD, I think we could say. He also has, similar to Rorschach in a way, he has an extreme morality where he's literally willing to kill millions of people in order to accomplish his goal, which is
hyper pragmatic outlook on the world.
Right. And evil. I mean, like he's evil.
Yeah. Evil.
So a couple.
Why don't we explain the underlying tensions in the book that lead to even the thought process that gets us.
So basically, it's similar to our world in as much as the USSR and USA are at a kind of nuclear stalemate with missiles that's ready to fly at any minute. The big difference is Dr. Manhattan, who, after his emergence in the 1960, is the ultimate deterrent, right? Conceivably, he could make all the Russian nuclear missiles disappear in with a thought. Like, he's that powerful.
Yeah.
We see this because he goes to Vietnam during the 70s. Nixon's like, please, Dr. Manhattan, can you go to Vietnam? And he does. And we see a couple panels of him just as a giant, like, vaporizing, like, Viet Cong fighters. It's just like, oh, God. And the Vietnamese, when they capitulate, the North Vietnamese, they demand to, like, surrender to him personally. Mm-hmm. So he has to shake these guys' hands. It's like a long line of, like, guerrillas are lining up. As a result of the victory in Vietnam, Vietnam becomes the 51st state. And
Canada.
Yeah, beating even Canada to the punch. And it's a huge population. It's interesting. One thing I do like about the HBO sequel is that it explores, like, what are the implications of what has it been like if Vietnam's been a state for 30, 40 years, like. Yeah. It's a huge country. Like, there's, like, a lot. It's bigger than even Canada, right, in terms of population. Mm-hmm. So that's the big difference, is that you have this omnipotent guy, but Adrian is still unhappy with the situation because I think he kind of understands that Dr. Manhattan is ultimately kind of a non-entity, right? Like,
Why?
well, he sort of understands that he's passive, that he's not going to do anything to change things. Like, if someone pushes him to like stop because honestly, he could, snap his fingers and all the nuclear weapons in the world would disappear, right?
Yeah. So why doesn't he do that?
Well, because he's passive. Because he's
But
kind of
it's not from like it's beneath him or anything.
no, it's because he doesn't do that, right? Like he has this. There's this weird causality problem with him where he like knows everything he's gonna do, and that's not one of the things he's gonna do. It's hard to explain. He struggles to explain this to the other characters at several points, right? Basically, there's several themes that run through this story. One is there's a comic within the comic, right? That another like weird thing about this world is in the 30s and 40s, real costume vigilantes emerged. And as a result, superhero comics faded from popularity.
Yeah, this part.
So the most popular brand of comics are instead pirate comics. That you go to the comic shop and you're like, what's the latest piracy adventure?
Yeah.
And there's this comic that we see worked in through almost half the issues of the story, right? I think it starts in the 3rd or 4th issue and it runs all the way till the penultimate issue, is this story of the voyage of the Black Freighter, which is this tale of a guy who escapes this horrible... His ship is destroyed by pirates. He gets away. He's on a desert isle. He creates a raft out of the bodies of his dead fellow seamen, right? And I think a common interpretation of this is that this pirate, this sailor is Adrian, right?
Yes.
Like he's like gonna ride to safety on the bodies of other people, right? Mm-hmm. And towards the very end of the book, Adrian even makes a comment about the Black Freighter. It's kind of like, you didn't quite need to hammer that home, but you miss it if you aren't looking for it, right? I mean, I'm sure I didn't notice it the first 3 or 4 times I read it, maybe the first 1 or 2 times. The thing that makes this book so much better than most comics, though, is the interweaving of the subplots and the main plots, where you'll have a caption relating to one plot on a panel that's showing something about another plot, and their relation to each other isn't always one-to-one, but there's this suggestive synergy between the different levels of narrative that is constantly emerging and spinning out. There's also just the art is so dynamic. Yes. Like,
it's fantastic.
Like, this is the most, like, Gibbons did all the lettering by hand as well. Like, his lettering is the like default lettering that was used to make the font that people now use when they're making comics. Like, that's how, like,
oh really?
Yeah, his handwriting is like the basis for that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, why would you? but the other thing is, it's about like how being a costume vigilante is fundamentally like adolescent and immature, right? This is not something that happens
it's not like glorified.
Well, it's not something that's cool or that even really happens in a meaningful way, right?
Right.
Like, if we saw a headline like "Costume Man Stops Bank Robbery," we wouldn't be like, awesome. We'd be like, oh, a mentally ill person has stopped a bank robbery, right? And Moore gets that. I mean, Moore is a critic of superhero comics. I mean, he made a lot of money writing them. He's became famous, but he also wrote a lot of, the other things Moore is famous for are books like V for Vendetta, a similarly kind of apocalyptic tale we might have to tackle at some point in the future, and then Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing is a classic DC character from the 70s, but Moore's take on it is much more about the history of sci-fi. It's about the ecological crisis, right? His Swamp Thing is also just amazing. And then the other thing is his From Hell, his like massive book about the Jack the Ripper case, right? Which is just
That sounds fun.
Yeah, they made a terrible movie of it starring Johnny Depp as Inspector Abelline in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's very bad.
Like when the man could do no wrong.
Well,
I mean, he was wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this was very wrong. This is a bad movie. There's also a movie of Watchmen, done by Zack Snyder, which is almost too faithful. They change a few things in a way that I think is not good. But it's almost too. He's too devoted to the original. I don't know. It's a weird problem with adaptation, right? You can be too faithful to the book, right?
Well, what do you think about the Watchmen show?
About
do it sometime down the line, but the HBO.
Well, I think it's interesting, right? Because one of the things that is not a big text of this story is race, right? And I think there is some stuff with race, like we see the black psychiatrist who interviews Rorschach when he's in prison. Is we see his struggles with his wife. There's a couple of race, like the newspaper guy makes a remark. His wife's looking for him. He's like, "Oh, you should ask the black guy on the corner." And she's like, "What? You think we all know each other?"
Yeah.
And certainly Rorschach and the heroes. There's a funny moment in the mid '60s. This guy from the '40s, Captain Metropolis, is trying to get a new superhero team together. The original team in the '40s was called the Minutemen, and he's going to call them the Crime Busters, I think is what it's called. And he has on the list on the board of the like crimes they're going to stop, and it's like racial riots, student protests, right? So it's like the crimes they're aiming at in the '60s are like leftist protest movements. So like throughout this, you get this idea that like, oh yeah, like vigilantism is like an essentially right-wing thing in a way that you don't often think about when you're reading like a Spider-Man comic. You're not like, oh, here comes right-wing hero Spider-Man to like punch that mugger out, which is interesting. So what the show in the 2019 did was to like recenter the focus. It imagines that the legacy of Rorschach is basically a bunch of KKK people like become the new Rorschachs.
Yeah.
And, he's picking up on, it's by Damon Lindelof, our beloved creator of The Leftovers, who we'll be coming back to sooner or later. And I think it's like an interesting and smart idea. It ultimately, I think it couldn't quite land it, right? I think the ending doesn't really satisfy in the way the ending in this is so perfectly satisfying. And I think there's some great performances. I really like the guy who plays Looking Glass, the guy who's traumatized by having been a witness to the catastrophe of the ending of this story. I'll watch it again eventually. It's been a few years since I've seen it.
Yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it in a year's time or so.
Yeah, that'd be good. The other thing I was saying is impotence is a major theme, right? And this idea that in addition to being a right-wing fantasy, these superhero costumes are also just like a fetish, right? That there's something almost like S&M about we're getting into our gear. We see this when there's a riot and the comedian basically has a GIMP mask on, right? He's like shooting tear gas into a crowd and he's got this like zipper mouth. You're just like what are we doing here? And this is typified by when Dan Dreiberg, Night Owl, and Sally or Laurie, just Pessish, Silk Spectre 2, they hook up and he can't perform, right? The first time he's nervous, doesn't work. Later, they get back into his owl costume. They put their suits on. They haven't been heroes in 8 years. They haven't done anything. And they rescue these people from a fire. And after that, they're just so turned on that it just...
sounds pretty hot, yeah.
And it's like the costume is this fetish object that enables that. Again, that ties into the idea of them as being
man still got his fastball.
Yeah, but only when he's got the suit on.
Only when he's got the suit on.
Yeah. Which I think is funny. I mean, what do you think about like costume vigilantism? Like it's kind of weird how prevalent that idea is in our culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, not being a real thing at all.
Yeah, and just like the sort of, there's something just, I guess, inherently liberating about being hidden.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That one's true essence can come out because one cannot be seen.
Well, this is what Batman.
Obviously, Batman is the
right. That Bruce Wayne is the costume. Batman is the real guy.
That's right.
This is like a common reading of Batman, right? And it is a power fantasy, right? It's like, I mean, Superman originated after, I forget if Jerry Siegel or Joe Shuster, one of their fathers was a shopkeeper who was killed in a robbery. And Superman, what if this guy who was bulletproof and ultra strong had been there to save my dad, right? That's like where all of this comes from. And it's not disconnected from a misreading of the Nietzschean Superman, right? This idea of the new man who's like more powerful. That's not, I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but that's not really what Nietzsche meant by that. But never mind, that was an idea that was in the culture, much in the way that Freud was in the culture in the 30s, right? That this idea that there's these subconscious drives and desires, and then also just Darwin, evolution, right? That we might evolve into something better, and that these costumes become not only disguises, but a kind of garment you put on that demarcates you as this superior, more evolved being.
Right.
Which I think is interesting. Let's just talk about, shall we move into the end?
Why don't you explain let's recap Adrian, sort of what he pulls off.
So
and what the basic underlying thinking is.
Yeah. So Adrian, as we've alluded, is a genius. He was one of these costume adventurers. He retired early. He merchandised himself. He built off that merchandise an empire that is invested in companies across the world, right? He's got
selling merch. It's so good.
Right. You see him like examining the specs of like the new like new action figures of him, right? At one point. And Rorschach kind of mocks him. He's like, "You're soft, like you sold out." And he's like, there's a great moment when Rorschach is saying something and he's like, "By this token, I would be a Nazi." And Adrian Veed is like, "No." You a Nazi? His basic thinking is, look, we need to survive as a species. It's kind of Elon coded, although, Elon could never pull off something this interesting. Probably something this evil, but it would be a much stupider form of evil.
Much stupider.
And basically he sets up this, and it's a long con, right? I mean, he starts poisoning.
Yeah, it's the whole book. It's the whole thing.
No, but it's been going on since the 60s. Like he's been working towards this. He's poisoned Dr. Manhattan's friend. He buys this company called Dimension Developments that's working on teleportation and like contacting other dimensions. And its office is conveniently located right next to Madison Square Garden, where much of the book is set. So we constantly see it in the background, Dimensional Extra Spatial Institute or whatever. He also hires all these artists and writers to create these sort of, including the writer of the pirate book within the story, right? And they're all sent off to an island for a few years. And basically what he's done is he's cloned a gigantic like squid brain, which he's copied for. He's like squid body, but he's put the brain of a troubled young psychic into it. And he's encoded the brain somehow with all these horrifying images and visions that these writers and artists have been working on under the guise they think that they're just working on a super secretive movie, right? they're like, wow, this new Star Wars sequel is really secretive. We're on this island. We're just making this
special effects are going to be amazing.
Yeah, this beak. Did you see the beak? Beak is incredible. Right? Like, and basically, what happens in the whole story is he's been working on this for years. He's gonna poison Dr. Manhattan and get him to leave the Earth. Hopefully, he's also developed these like tachyon fields that are disrupting Dr. Manhattan's clear foresight. So they're kind of blank spots in the future where he can't quite tell what's going to happen. Yeah. It works. Like there's an expose. Dr. Manhattan is accused of causing cancer to his friends and enemies. He flees. He goes to Mars. He hangs out on Mars for most of the comic. He's thinking about time. He's thinking about his life. He's building a giant clock castle on Mars. He eventually brings his ex-girlfriend. They have a long, conversation. She convinces him that human life actually has value, that each individual human is a thermodynamic miracle, that the like possibilities of that single person existing over the whole span of human history of all their parents meeting and the grandparents meeting and all that. He's like, oh wow, you're right. That is as miraculous as any of these natural events. I'm fascinated.
He's like, I knew I could fix him.
Yeah. Well, she's still gonna break up with him though. But she did fix him. And by the end of the story, the great moment is he teleports this massive brain in this squid body with tentacles. What's that?
Adrian does. From his base in Antarctica,
where he has this castle that he calls Karnak. This is attended by these Vietnamese servants whom he murders because they know too much, right? And the squid just appears next door to MSG during this huge concert in the
Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, clear. Yeah, during the middle of early November, as Dr. Manhattan's disappearance has also caused an escalation of tensions where nuclear war seems imminent. Soviets are invading Pakistan. They're like going to conquer Europe next. When will the U.S. say enough is enough and let the rockets fire? This giant thing appears and kills 3 million people on landing.
Just 3 million.
And then drives many others insane because of this psychic wave that it unleashes on detonation. This is the other big sci-fi. I mean, obviously you can't teleport a giant squid into New York, whatever, but a psychic's brain. So you're like, okay, there are psychics also. It's not just Dr. Manhattan. But, and the heroes kind of figure this out. Like, they figure out that he's the one who's responsible for killing all these people, that he killed the comedian, that he, framed Dr. Manhattan. Rorschach and Night Owl take his owl ship to Antarctica. Okay, like, that thing has great battery life. But anyway.
Get your owl ship.
Yeah, get the owl ship. We're going. And they confront him. They're basically like, Adrian, like, hilariously just beats
I love the idea of confronting. Hey, so
and like they're like, we have to take him quick, and it's like there's two regular guys, and like Rorschach's tiny, he wears lifts in his shoes, right? I mean, and he's effortlessly beating them up. They shoot something at him, he like throws a plate, he like breaks their nose, Rorschach's gonna stab him with a fork, he just like smashes it, right? I mean, he totally outclasses them. And the great moment in the story is they're like, Adrian, you're gonna, he tells him when he's done. He tells him, this brain is the whole thing we just went over. And they're like, Adrian, you can't possibly be serious. You can't do this. We're going to stop you. And he's like, well, I'm not some Republic serial villain. Like, you think I'd really monologue about this if there was any chance of you stopping me? I did it 35 minutes ago. And then he like turns on the TV and it's like, horror in New York, right? Like, now, Dr. Manhattan and Laurie, meanwhile, have been on Mars talking. They return to New York, where she lives, right next to Madison Square Garden, to find everyone is dead, and there's this giant squid tentacles, really horrific nightmare. And she's like, I want to leave, John. I don't like this. And he's like, something's disturbed. There's a disturbance in the force. Like, it's coming from Antarctica. And she's like, remember we went to Adrian? So then they appear to confront Adrian. Laurie's pissed. She shoots him, but he catches the bullet, right? Because he's so highly trained. He's like, oh, it's another thing I didn't know that I could do. So he's so high on himself. He's like, Jason Tatum. He's like, we did it! Like, he's fully like He's fully, and they're like, we were going to tell the world about this. He's like, oh, really? You're going to tell the world, and therefore that this is fake. It's not a real alien attack. Because
that's an important part of it.
Because the premise is that the thing that
he is creating an alien threat
that will unite the world.
That it will de-escalate the situation, particularly between the U.S. and USSR, and by extension, sort of unite the world, right?
Exactly. And this is not an original. Moore's not the first person to ever do this. There was an Outer Limits episode that's actually alluded to in the last panels of the comic. That was sort of about this same idea back in the 60s. Some people have been like, Moore ripped that off, and it's like, you idiots. Like, it's not just the idea, it's the execution. Like, look at how well this is all wrought together. It's like, oh, Shakespeare didn't make any of his own plots.
You really shouldn't touch on this. Outer Limits already covered it.
Zing. So all the
characters. It is an interesting question that sort of brings us to the apocalyptic nature of the podcast.
Yeah,
right?
That's why I wanted to do this.
I think it's something that is very interesting to write about in the 80s, right? Like that this theory, like, could this actually help, right?
Yeah.
Like, it seems quite clear that today common threats do not do anything but divide further. Would you say?
I would agree, right? I think if aliens appeared today, it would be like the libs would be like, it's a Russian alien.
Right. We already have common threats all over.
Bird flu, COVID,
whatever I've got now. Yeah. Whatever mystery ailment, but like, no, like, I mean, COVID, the climate. I mean, obviously, like, these are common threats.
But I think the idea is that the spectacle of the alien, of the giant alien with tentacles, is a kind of would be more unifying in the way that 9/11 was unifying.
If you were to put together like a 5-minute, sizzle reel of all the worst ecological catastrophes over the last 20 years,
sure,
right? And be like, we should probably, maybe this will do it, you know?
Yeah. Well, Al Gore tried, right?
People look at it and be like, yeah, right? I forgot about that. There was a whole documentary.
Yeah, that was what he was trying to do. I think it's interesting. I think the final conclusion of the story is fun too, because the rational characters, Silk Spectre, Night Owl, and Dr. Manhattan are all like, yeah, we can't do anything. He's right. Like, we've just got to be passive. Like, but Rorschach, the uncompromising one, is like, no, truth is all that matters.
Yeah.
And you can understand why Rorschach is like a hero to the QAnon types, right? These like truth tellers who are so obsessed with the truth and so utterly unable to see themselves with any kind of perspective, right? Like,
that any event is orchestrated, has some meaning beneath it that it's our job to figure out.
Right. And then in the final scene, he's leaving. He's like going to go back to civilization. He's going to steal the owl ship. Dr. Manhattan just goes outside. In the one moment in the story when he seems to be active, he vaporizes Rorschach. And then he goes back in to talk to Adrian, and he's like, don't think Rorschach will be reaching civilization. This is kind of like, wow, it's a little wry, Dr. Manhattan. And, Adrian's like, did I do the right thing, Dr. Manhattan? Like, now that it's over, like, have I won? And then enigmatically, Dr. Manhattan's like, Adrian, nothing ever ends. And by the way, I'm going off to visit different galaxies. Goodbye. And Adrian's kind of left like he has no peer. Dr. Manhattan was his only person he saw as a peer, not an intellect, at least in capacity. And so he's triumphed, but he's triumphed alone. He can never sort of...
Right, but then there's also the journal, the newspaper, right?
Well, the newspaper, the right-wing crank newspaper that Rorschach loves, has his journal.
The New Frontiersman?
Yeah, the New Frontiersman, but it's in the crank file. And there's a kid who has the smiley face logo that is a motif that appears throughout the comic, right? That idea, the smiley face with the blood drop through the eye, right?
Well, let me ask you a question, though.
Sure.
It ends with this, at the top of this pile is the journal of Rorschach. So, like, if Dr. Manhattan decides to stop him, right?
Well, he kills him. Yeah.
Yeah. Why wouldn't? And he knows everything and he sees everything. Doesn't he know and see that the journals?
But we don't know. We don't know if the journal's going to come out. We don't know if it does come out because it's coming out.
But he knows.
Yeah, but he isn't capable of. Yeah, you got me. Well, he's gonna.
Why wouldn't?
But he's also gonna leave. He's gonna go off to Alpha Centauri or whatever.
Yeah, right.
So maybe he's just not paying attention to Earth anymore.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
But it's a great, not cliffhanger, but just a great note to end on is the fact that all of this could come out, but it'll come out in a disreputable source that no one believes, except for crazy people like Rorschach.
Yeah.
And will people believe it? Right? The other implication is Nixon's not going to run for re-election. He's had enough. But Robert Redford is going to be the new president, right? Which is something the show picks up on.
We could have done worse.
Well, we have. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's a great book. Reading it is always fun. Every time I read it, I'm just like, oh, yeah, this just hits all the notes. It's really tightly wound together. And so to follow it up, we have another of my favorite works of art next week, which is Todd Haynes' film Safe, which you have not seen before, right, Michael?
I have not seen it before. So,
sort of early tour de force Julianne Moore performance. I mean, have you seen any Todd Haynes? Todd Haynes is one of our greatest directors.
Yeah.
He just did May December that came out in the last year. Yeah. Also with Julianne Moore. Oh, you didn't like it? I thought it was really good. With the Mary Kay Letourneau story. In any case, this is a story about environmental illness, also set in 1987, interestingly. We're going back a little bit. And I think it'll have some interesting resonances.
And I'll have more to say.
Yeah, because hopefully you'll be better, right?
Yeah. It's giving me it gave me a new respect for Michael Jordan in the flu game.
Yeah.
I feel like it would be really hard to dominate a game of basketball right now.
You're not going to score 45 points on
I think I'm pretty sure I just went
22 shooting or whatever.
Pretty sure I just went 1 for 12 from the field and fouled it in the second quarter.
Stop.
But no, it was great to do one that you how many times we do stuff we don't really like, and this one really is a spectacular work.
Yeah. No, it's great. But until then, you can follow us on Instagram at The End of the World, WMS. You can follow us on the podcatcher of your choice, where it would be wonderful if you left a rating and or review. We've gotten some more reviews lately, which is thrilling and makes me very happy. They're flooding in. We're awash in them. The reviews we're drowning in the reviews.
But it's never enough. It's never enough.
More.
More 5 stars.
Yeah. So next week will be Safe. And until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.